actually. Richard has had to give his apologies because he's required a deanery synod this evening to talk about the plan for our deanery, which is really important, and Richard has been involved in working on that plan, so he feels that he ought to be there. I ought to be there, but some of us need to be here. This is the fifth of our lectures. As you know, some of you will have a complete clean sweep of all of them, but this is very different. This is addressing a topic which is very relevant to what we're going to all probably be doing later in the year, and that is voting at a general election. And so it's a great pleasure to welcome Jonathan Bartley and he is a kind of personification of a think tank. If you've never seen a think tank in person, so we can expect to have something which is really intellectually stimulating, and I believe that he's going to be a bit provocative. You would expect him to be a bit provocative because the think tank that he founded in 2001, Ekklesia, is dealing with the interface between faith and politics. And anything that has to do with politics nowadays is likely to be fairly provocative. And when you put the two things, like oil and water, faith and politics, together, you can have combustion. So, although probably not in a scientific way, but you work your metaphors out, or work my metaphors out for me. But anyway, Jonathan comes with a background which mixes theology and politics. He's worked in politics, in fact worked for John Major, but he's at pains to emphasise that when he was working for John Major, he wasn't a conservative, or he'll explain if I get it wrong, but he brings no prejudice to this at all, apart from a passion for informing people and getting faith into the political area, I think, and possibly getting politics into the faith area as well. So you've heard enough from me, and I'm going to hand over to Jonathan. And thank you very much for coming. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say and being provoked.
Thank you. Is this loud enough? Too loud? Okay. I have 3 children, and my little girl lost her first tooth, my youngest, yesterday, and the tooth fairy visited last night, which was very pleased. So I thought I'd just kick off with just a little story about a little girl who was settling into bed, her father about to read her a bedtime story. And she asked her dad, "Do all fairy tales begin once upon a time?" The father replied, "No, some fairy tales begin with, 'When I'm elected.'" The good news is that at this general election, it looks as if there will be more briefings, more resources available perhaps than ever before to help churches think about policy from a Christian perspective. The bad news is that such things don't seem to have made a huge identifiable difference to the voting habits of Christians themselves. A wide-ranging and in-depth survey by Comres, the pollsters, last month showed that religious people were no more likely to vote than the wider population, and nor were those self-identifying as Christians more likely to place their cross in a different place to everyone else. But there was also cause for hope for those who drilled down into the survey data. Tucked away in the results was the finding that those religious people who described their beliefs as important and having a significant impact on their lives were also much more likely to vote Liberal Democrat. Having nailed my colours to the mast about working for John Major, I will hastily say this is not a party election broadcast for the Liberal Democrats. But given the tendency for people to vote very tactically, usually and often only for the big parties who have a chance of winning in any constituency, the votes for the Liberal Democrats amongst the people who describe their faith as very important and influencing their lives perhaps shows that those types of people are prepared to vote more as an act of witness rather than a bid to control who returns to Westminster, an act of witness rather than the bid to determine the election result, which I think is very interesting and will underpin what I'm going to say tonight. So on 6th of May, where will you put your cross? Where we put the cross and where we put our cross are perhaps two very different propositions. The cross of Christ, of course, is political, but it's a different kind of politics. The cross of Jesus, perhaps better seen as a warning, a question mark even, something that reminds us that power can have terrible consequences. And the cross of Christ also, of course, reminds us that it isn't just a case of whether faith and politics should mix, whether oil and water should come together. It poses such questions as what kind of faith and what kind of politics. For the best part of 1700 years, such questions about faith and politics have been answered mainly through the Christendom settlement between churches and government. Christendom, both a culture and a power structure which dominated Western Europe for centuries. Emerged around the time of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, began its decline perhaps around the time of the Reformation and the English Civil War. It shaped our theology, our ecclesiology, it shaped our politics, and it shaped our political structures. And it's only really now that we can properly say we are emerging from it. The Christendom culture, the Christendom settlement is disappearing, but its legacy is still very visible. And what's coming in its place is not clear. We're in a time of transition, something that we might term post-Christendom. And for the churches, this election will very much be a post-Christendom election. Now, a couple of qualifications. Post-Christendom doesn't mean post-Christian. Christendom was certainly religious, but some would maintain what happened during Christendom wasn't always particularly Christian. There are the obvious injustices that we could point to, in which the churches, of course, were complicit, waging wars, persecution, slavery, economic oppression, crusades, inquisitions. And nor does post-Christendom mean secular. Certainly there may be a lot less religion around today, but instead of secularism, many have observed a de-secularization or a resurgence in interest in matters religious and spiritual. The churches may be losing their dominance, losing their centrality, but this doesn't mean that religion isn't around. A book published last year by two American authors who worked for The Economist suggested God is back. They did a global survey of religion around the world. And they found that in pretty much every other part of the world outside Western Europe, outside North America, religion seemed to be growing. There was a bit of a revival going on in their terms. There are now more Christians in China than there are members of the Communist Party. That's according to official figures. And we will continue here to experience the consequences of what's going on, not least through migration into this country as we're seeing its effect on the churches now. But it's perhaps more accurate to say not that God is back, but that religion is relocating. Religion is changing its position. And as part of that, there is a new relationship developing between the church and state, between religion and public life. So post-Christendom, the time that we experience now, is a journey. No one's quite sure where it's going to take us and where we're going to end up. But what we can do is observe some of the features of that journey, features of the landscape, and get an idea, a little bit, of what is up ahead. And my colleague Stuart Murray at Ekklesia has suggested 7 features of post-Christendom, which I've adapted for a particularly political context, post-Christendom being both a cultural experience as well as a political one. But these are the kind of political features of what's going on within this post-Christendom transitional phase. Firstly, Christianity is moving from the centre to the margins. Within Christendom, the Christian story and the churches were often central to the business of government. And whilst the churches clearly do exert influence, now that influence is far more marginal. The church is moving from a position of being a majority to a minority. In Christendom, those who called themselves Christians comprised the often overwhelming majority. And it's often easy for them to exert political influence, political power. In post-Christendom, they're taking a place as a minority. From settlers to sojourners, in Christendom, Christians felt at home in a culture largely shaped by their story. They aligned themselves and took part in the activity of governing. In post-Christendom, they will feel much more like aliens, exiles, perhaps pilgrims. From privilege to plurality. In Christendom, Christians enjoyed many privileges. Often, those privileges were enshrined in the law. Often, it was the privilege of government itself. In post-Christendom, they have to exercise influence by witnessing, there's that word again, witnessing to their story and its implications. Fifthly, from a position of control to that position of witness. In Christendom, churches often exercised control over society, perhaps most notably by legal sanction, backed up by the state as sanctions for lawbreakers. In post-Christendom, they will need to exercise influence far more by witnessing to their story and the implications of that story. From maintenance to mission. In Christendom, the emphasis was often on maintaining supposedly Christian status quo, often through the machinery of government and the law. In post-Christendom, the emphasis is far more on mission within a now contested environment. And lastly, from institution to movement. In Christendom, churches operated mainly as institutions, which made it far easier to be part of the machinery of government. In post-Christendom, they must reimagine themselves once again as a movement. It's a lot to take in. Seismic shifts, actually, when you consider the 1700 years that have gone before. And of course, many vestiges of Christendom still remain, including some that were comparatively late arrivals on the scene. Post-Christendom is a real mix. We have bishops in the House of Lords. A quarter of primary schools are state-funded church schools. Prayers said before Parliament sits. The churches preside at major events, coronations, Remembrance Day. Chaplaincy roles exist in hospitals, in the army, in prisons. Christian acts and worship are still a legal requirement in broadcasting and in schools. There's special tax relief for those engaged in charitable activities of a religious nature. But even these things now are changing, and they're changing very, very rapidly. There is a real fluidity about these things. Now, for some, post-Christendom is undoubtedly a threat. People will see it as a threat. They see things changing, and they don't like what they see. They fight against it. They attempt sometimes to maintain those privileges, maintain opt-outs or negotiate new opt-outs and exemptions for religion in general, for Christianity and the churches in particular. For others, however, it has to be acknowledged, it is a liberation, a chance for a more equal, a free and fair society. And for some Christians, a chance for the churches once more to be more Christian in their view. But whatever one's views, and I'm sure people here will fall into possibly both of those categories, this is where we are. And it's in this context, I think, that there are two distinct ways that churches are seeking to present themselves politically. And we're seeing this already, even before the general election campaign gets underway. The first tendency amongst some in the churches, which in itself is a legacy of Christendom, is to seek to portray the churches as kingmakers. These are the people who will fight the loss of power and control. Many still believe that the churches have it. It's fascinating. I mentioned the survey right at the beginning last month that was carried out by Comres, a poll of how voting intentions were being voting intentions of Christians. Now, these were actually spun very successfully by some in the churches. Churches can spin too. The Comres poll found that Christians were actually likely to vote exactly the same way, pretty much, as everyone else. However, the survey data was presented by some church groups as suggesting exactly the opposite, saying the churches actually might hold the key to the general election. They would still be the kingmakers. And so successful was that spinning, some people might have heard it on the Sunday programme on Radio 4. This was the story that was told. Churches hold the key to the election. Certainly it was in the Times and a number of other newspapers. Those were the headlines that were carried. The results of the poll were actually turned around to mean exactly the opposite of what they found. And that was largely because of the approach that some in the churches took. Under such an approach, which appeals to many in the institutional churches, the church sees itself as influential and the church sees itself as important. It keeps telling itself and reinforcing that message. But actually, all it's really doing is perpetuating a false consciousness and failing to face up to the realities of post-Christendom. And if it carries on that way, it will fail to be effective in post-Christendom. Strongly associated with that position is the belief that Britain is a Christian country. A particular statistic often wheeled out and quoted is that 72% of people at the last census identified with Christianity. Britain, it's argued, is essentially a Christian country, and therefore Christianity needs to have special privileges and power. But there's a second way that some in the churches are responding to post-Christendom, and that, by huge contrast, is to present itself as a persecuted minority. In the last few years, it's been proposed that Christians are being marginalised, being suspended in the workplace, losing jobs, being forced to remove religious symbols. You remember the story about the British Airways stewardess. The tide of secularism, it's sometimes claimed, has reached such a point that Christians are being oppressed. Quite often the comparison is also made between Christianity and Islam, with the allegation that Muslims receive far better treatment than Christians. George Carey, for example, has repeatedly talked about Christian discrimination, often linking it with Islam and what he would term the forces of migration. Under such an approach, the state is seen as passing laws that are discriminatory against Christians, and the calls increase that Christians should receive special protections as a minority as a result. What are the implications of these two approaches? Which is one, that the churches are very influential, they have the power, they are the kingmakers, and the other approach that they are persecuted, oppressed, discriminated against minority that need special protections. Well, the churches are not the only ones to have taken up the theme of Christian Britain. Last year, the British National Party created a billboard poster, I don't know if anyone saw it, featuring Jesus Christ. Picture of Jesus Christ on the British National Party billboard. It had Jesus on the cross, and underneath it had a Bible verse, quoting from the Gospel of John. It stated, "If they have persecuted me, they will also persecute you," John 15:20. The question was posed underneath, what would Jesus do? The advert directly related and came as a response to General Synod's motion against clergy and church workers being members of the racist party. And there's been a growing debate within the church about how one responds to extremist parties, candidates, particularly if the church holds many election hustings meetings, it has to face up to this issue. Does it invite the BNP candidates or not? If so, how much platform does it give them? The church has pretty much got itself in a pickle over this one. Since before the last European elections, around 2004 I think it was, Ekklesia has been monitoring the activities of the party and actually the deliberate play of the British National Party to make an appeal to Christians. It began when I was taking part actually in a Radio 5 live interview discussing religion and politics. And quite out of the blue, the British National Party's press officer called up the programme, came on the phone. And he proceeded to make the case that the British National Party was actually a Christian party. I nearly fell off my chair, out of surprise. But since then, the argument has been gathering pace in no uncertain terms. We've been examining in particular the party's Christian nation rhetoric, the identification of Christianity with the nation state, with what it means to be, in their words, indigenous white British. It soon became clear that the party was making a concerted effort to recruit support from those who also identified Britishness or Englishness with Christianity. And one of the primary goals has been to increase opposition to Islam and play on people's fears over migration. You can see how it fits together. Sadly, it's also been drawing large support from Christians who feel marginalised and vulnerable. The BNP's campaign has involved the establishment of a new front organisation called the Christian Council of Britain. Its founder, the self-styled Reverend Robert West, has stood as a BNP candidate in a by-election in Norwich. When the BNP's membership list was published on the internet about a year and a half, 2 years ago, we did an analysis of the names that were there, and we found next to a lot of the entries were little notes about the people who were on the BNP's membership list. A number of church leaders appeared to be listed. I think there were 5 in total. This briefly made the headlines, but this wasn't actually the real cause of concern. Some members were listed as Pentecostal Christians attending an Assemblies of God church. Another was a Quaker, another practicing Catholic. Others were said to be cathedral tour guides, members of the Anglican Society, supporters of the Evangelical Open Doors charity. Another was listed as someone who preached regularly in Baptist, United Reformed and Presbyterian churches. One was described as a committed evangelical Christian who attended Bible studies and prayer meetings. Others were described as born-again Christians. One had an email address identified and linked to a Christian bookshop. I think we have to take this seriously. I don't know if the churches are. I'm going to read you a quote now, and it's time for the first bit of interaction. I want some ideas about who this might be saying, making this quote. At the end I'll ask for a show of hands, and so think about who you can imagine saying this. Christianity has been at the heart of the history of this nation. British history, customs, and ethos have been gradually shaped by Christianity. A recent correspondence suggested that, like it or not, Britishness is rooted in the Christian religion. Consider our national anthem, beginning with the word God. Consider the English flag, designed using the Christian cross. Christianity is the tapestry upon which our country's heritage was woven. All of this is lost on those who would deny Christianity any place in our nation today. The message is clear. Wake up, Christian England. Anyone want to venture a guess?
I'm going to say.
Sounds like it, doesn't it? This is the first point where I'm about to get myself into trouble. Go on. Anyone else want to venture a guess?
Enoch Powell.
Enoch Powell, not Enoch Powell. You guess.
The Archbishop of York.
Got it in mind. Well done.
Sorry, I read the Daily Mail.
It was. It was written in the Daily Mail. It was written in the Daily Mail.
An excellent article.
John Sentamu is, of course, and I will quickly say this, a fierce opponent of the BNP. Someone actually who suffered personally for his stand against them. You cannot question his anti-racist credentials. But his rhetoric, his example, highlights a dilemma, the great white elephant in the room, if you like, that no one wants to acknowledge, let alone address. Ideas of Christian Britain, Christian England, the Christian nation are playing into the hands of the far right. It's a toxic mix when you then combine them with inflammatory rhetoric about the marginalisation and persecution of Christians. And it's an ideology which many Christians are taking up in significant numbers. But if we're not then to portray ourselves as a persecuted minority on the one hand, or continue on as if Christendom was still a reality on the other, what should our response be? It is indeed a terrible irony that the BNP is posing the question which Christians should have asked themselves already. What would Jesus do? The answer, which is lost on the BNP and some in the churches, of course, is found in Matthew's Gospel. But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who insult you. There's a third response which I want to offer tonight, which the Church could pursue with regard to government and with regard to the issues that are being raised. And that is one which recognises that the Church's primary calling is not control or to present itself as a persecuted minority, but to faithfully witness. And this is a huge challenge. One of the central problems is that witness has rarely been seen in political terms by the Church. Probably a number of people listening will think, witness, what has that got to do with politics? It's naive. Too often witness has been privatised, it's been depoliticised, it's been spiritualised, or explained away as impractical or inappropriate for public life. I want to suggest that the theology, a lot of the theology of Christendom, hasn't equipped the Church that well for the post-Christendom journey. Whereas, for example, the Christians pre-Constantine in the first few centuries would take Jesus' teachings about love of enemies, forgiveness, turning the other cheek, relatively at face value, although they were a mixed bunch, certainly. Such ideas seem ill-suited to a version of Christianity that was aligned with the state, that was aligned with the empire, that had to play a part in defending an empire and waging war on behalf of that empire. As my colleague Stuart Murray has pointed out, Jesus was actually somewhat embarrassing to the emperors. It's time to rediscover the politics of Jesus. The other day, a rabbi with whom I work sent me an email addressing the activities of those he considered were his political opponents. In it, he wrote resolutely, "We didn't turn the other cheek, we decided to take action." It's a legacy of Christendom that the phrase turning the other cheek remains part of popular discourse. But it's also a legacy that the phrase is interpreted in that specific way. It's taken to mean inaction, passivity in the face of hostility. And when it comes to a viable political strategy or engagement, not surprisingly, it doesn't often figure. Simply letting your opponent have another slug is not only impractical, it's downright naive, not to mention painful. At first reading, Matthew's Gospel seems pretty unequivocal. You've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. When the King James Bible was being translated, however, antisthenai in the Greek was translated resist not. A more accurate interpretation would be resist not violently. But when you're a king, you aren't going to be keen on any type of resistance, violent or otherwise. And it's little wonder that the phrase was chosen to rule out resistance of all kinds. An alternative and now well-known interpretation is offered by the theologian Walter Wink. He points out that the Gospel writer records quite specifically what Jesus says. If anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Why the right cheek? I'll be volunteer. Come on, be brave.
No. I did know once.
come and stand here. You just have to be passive. Just turn the other cheek. Why the right cheek? Wink points out, I've got to focus because this is a bit complicated. Excuse me while I read the points. The right hand, presumably, would have been used. Not just because it was usually the dominant one, but because in Eastern culture, the left would have been considered unclean. Those that have travelled to certain Eastern cultures will recognise that. As the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, specify, even a gesture with the left hand, a Qumran, carried a penalty of 10 days penance. What we're dealing with here is also an insult. Don't worry. It's an insult, not...
You do your work.
Not a It's an insult, not a fist fight. A strike to the right cheek could only take place with the right hand, but you can't hit the right cheek with the back of your hand. I would have to, you can't hit the right cheek with your right fist. The intention is not to injure, but to humiliate. It was in fact a way of admonishing inferiors. So the only way I can hit the right cheek, as is specified, is with the back of my hand, like that. An insult, a humiliation to someone who's an inferior. As Wink goes on to say, as Wink goes on to say, why then does Jesus counsel those already humiliated people to turn the other cheek? Because he says this action robs the oppressor of the power to humiliate. The person who turns the other cheek is in effect saying, try again, your first blow failed to achieve its intended effect. I deny you the power to humiliate me. I am a human being made in God's image, just like you. Your status does not alter that. You cannot demean me. And such a response would create huge difficulties, clearly, for the striker. Purely logistically, how can I now hit the other cheek? I can't backhand it with my right hand. If I hit with a fist, I make myself an equal, acknowledging the other person as a peer. But the whole point of the back of the hand was to reinforce a caste system, an institutionalised inequality. Thank you very much. You won't worry, please. So our witness can be an active and engaging process, not just a passive and inactive one. Witness can be political, with political signals, with political engagement. It's just that we've got to start to discover how to do it. We've not often seen witness in such terms. Indeed, Christendom in many respects blunted and changed the political nature of the gospel message. Kings and emperors aren't going to put up with subversive religion that challenges power. Christians were faced with a bit of a dilemma when Christianity became part of the empire that had, after all, put their founder to death. How were they going to square Jesus' teachings with their new role as part of the empire that tortured, that waged war, that crucified, that imprisoned? Jesus' teachings, and indeed his death and resurrection, stood as a challenge to those things. There are a number of responses. Privatisation. Jesus was granted moral authority over people's personal behaviour. You can turn the other cheek perhaps in your personal relationships, but not over political or public affairs. This, for example, sometimes led Christian soldiers being urged to love and pray for those people they had just killed. Clericalisation, a distinction was made between clergy and laity. For Eusebius, pacifism was for clergy, monks and nuns, whereas lay Christians were obligated to defend the empire with force. There was a separation. An idea particularly prevalent at the time of the Reformation was that faith could be distinguished from works. It was the motivation behind people's acts that was important, not the act itself. There was marginalisation. Sometimes the teachings of Jesus were just ignored completely, and appeals were made to the Hebrew scriptures, which seemed more in keeping with the business of government. Christendom therefore brought with it a reading of the Bible and indeed a perspective on politics, which came from a position of wealth and power, but identified with the wealthy and powerful rather than the poor and marginalised. Now I want to do a little bit of group work, a little bit of experiment. I gather we've done this before in a Lent lecture. Do you have the Bibles?
Yeah, we have Bibles at the back, and they'll be handed round. This is an opportunity not just to do group work, but to do it in a very intimate fashion, because I don't think we've got enough Bibles for everyone. And that will teach those of us who didn't bring our Bibles next time to bring them. But the Bible's going to be passed around. The other thing is that, and I don't know whether this matters, you will find there's a slight mixture of versions.
That should be okay. It'll be interesting to see actually the different perspectives. How many have we got? Should we try splitting into groups? We only need one Bible per group.
All right.
So can we try and split into groups of maybe 5 or 6?
Oh, well, we've got plenty of Bibles.
Yeah, and you only need one Bible per group.